You're listening to episode 72 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. David L. McMahan talks with us today about the making of Buddhist modernism. Hi, everyone. Over the past year or so of the podcast, many of you have heard me use terms regarding the evolution of Buddhism in contemporary culture. Some of us also use terms like adaptation, but the underlying principle is the same. Buddhism is affected by conditions, and, as a product of the human mind, carried forward through time by human processing, it is irrevocably changed by those interactions. The book, The Making of Buddhist Modernism, is an excellent examination of the causes and conditions which have contributed to the overall landscape of contemporary Buddhism. Our guest, David L. McMahan, is Professor of Religious Studies at Franklin and Marshall College, having earned his Ph.D. at the University of California, Santa Barbara. His research focuses on Buddhism and modernity, South Asian Buddhism, and the effects of globalization. He has published a number of journal articles about these topics, and has presented lectures all over the world, most recently by invitation at Minzu University in Beijing, China. As with last week's episode, I really encourage you to take a look at the episode page for this interview. Thanks to the wonders of my Kindle, I've put together a pretty comprehensive set of quotes from the book and posted them there. So sit back, relax, and have a nice orange blossom. My roommate just made one. And our guest today is David McMahan, Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Franklin and Marshall College. David, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I must say I'm very eager to speak with you because one of my favorite books in my own studies of Buddhism has been your book, The Making of Buddhist Modernism, because it's helped answer a lot of questions that I have had about why are we seeing this evolution of a more contemporary Western way of practicing? And your book does a tremendous job of helping shed some light on that subject. So what I'd like to do is ask you first about your background and what led you to studying Buddhism.
Well, there are times when I wake up in the morning and think how weird it is that I am who I am right now. There's nothing in my background that would have predicted it. I grew up in a very small town in the Midwest, and I was a part of a very, very conservative Christian church growing up. And the only thing I ever heard about other Christian religions, or non-Christian religions, as well as most of the rest of Christianity, was that it was just wrong.
Yeah, many of us have had that experience growing up.
Yeah. Yes. And, somehow that started to gnaw at me when I was a teenager, when I was looking around at all my friends and all the people that I read about and heard about who were obviously not saved. And so since religion was really a part of my life and it was always a topic of conversation, and there was never any discouraging of thinking about things. And so I began thinking about things, and and reading about things, and I became interested in exploring various religious and philosophical traditions. And by the time I got to college, I was really actively interested in reading these things. And I majored in philosophy and psychology. I studied Western philosophy actually in college, and I also took the small smattering of classes that were offered in Asian traditions. There was a guy who taught some Zen Buddhism there, and that's when I first started to get some knowledge of the Buddhist tradition. And when I started to look into graduate school and started to contemplate the possibility of this kind of exploring of various ways of seeing things, and actually doing the kind of insane thing of trying to make a job out of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I initially looked at philosophy departments because I didn't really know anything about religious studies as a discipline. And realized that philosophy departments just didn't teach any. There were only a handful of graduate programs that taught anything in Asian traditions. And so I realized pretty quickly that it was in religious studies departments that you could study Asian philosophy and Asian religion and things like that. So I started looking into that, and so I ended up pursuing that in graduate school, and it's been a great experience. I've been able to travel many different places in Asia and around the world, and have had a great experience with the whole thing.
Now, what led you to writing the book on this particular topic? Because, of course, in Buddhism there are many, many different things one could write about as a scholar, particularly as a religious scholar with a background in philosophy. But you chose to write something about the impacts of modernism on Buddhism. What led you to that? Well,
that's another sort of odd turn. I was trained more in sort of Sanskrit and Pali traditions. My first book was actually on early Mahayana literature in Sanskrit, and that's really what I was focused on throughout graduate school. But in looking at this very ancient material and reading things that people had to say about it, I just couldn't help notice how much of the position of the writer was read into the material.
Yeah.
That you couldn't really study ancient texts without also sort of thinking about your own position in relation to them. And so that plus just a more abiding interest in some Western philosophy, and just sort of, my own situation. And in some ways, this was also a kind of exploration of my own approach, because I've been sitting since I was 18 or so, and I've always had a kind of minimalist approach to it. And when I started traveling around in Asia, I realized very quickly that Buddhism looks much different there than it does in America, and what people mean by Buddhism and understand by Buddhism is very different. So I began to appreciate the diversity of Buddhism throughout the world, and to realize that what I had taken as Buddhism from just reading kind of typical popular books on Buddhism early in my life really just represented a kind of thin slice of what was out there. And then I started to think about that thin slice a little bit more, and to find it more and more interesting how it came to be that particular way.
Yeah, you make a very good point that as we look at this adaptation of Buddhism, we see terms like Western Buddhism and American Buddhism or New Buddhism. And one of the quotes, and I'm going to quote you back to yourself, and you should go, wow, that was really great. Who said that? It was you. One of the quotes is, what scholars have often meant by Western Buddhism, American Buddhism, or New Buddhism is a facet of a more global network of movements that are not the exclusive product of any one geographic or cultural setting. And I think that's very key here, in that we're not seeing this specific to the Americas or the West.
Yeah. Well, I first started to think about American Buddhism and think I'm going to do some something on American Buddhism. But then when I started to look at it, I realized that it was really hard to localize it like that, that it really is, it's a global phenomenon. And that's what got me thinking more in the category of modern rather than American or Western.
Right, right. And you talk about also talking about modernism itself, it seems, if I'm reading this properly, that there are some traits that in my biology evolution mind I think of as selective pressures acting on a religious tradition that are the ones we see particularly with the modernist movement, and that is detraditionalization, demythologic. I'm not even quite sure how to say it, so I'll let you say it.
Students struggle with this too. Demythologization.
Yes, that, what he said. Great word. And same thing with psychologicalization.
Yeah, psychologization, yeah.
So tell us about each of those, because I know inherently what you mean, but each one is actually very distinct and has its own impact on the tradition.
Yeah. Well, the term demythologization comes from Rudolf Bultmann. He was a Christian theologian, very active and very well known in the 1960s. And he had the approach of looking back to the Gospels and saying, look, there is a lot about the Gospels that is really valuable. He called them, there are existential truths in the Gospels, but they're embedded in this very ancient worldview that we can't really embrace today. We can't really embrace the literal idea that people probably did embrace back then, that there's a heaven up in the sky or that there's an underworld down below, and all kinds of, that Jesus is literally going to come back in the sky. So he would say, look, what's the kind of inner meaning or the existential meaning or the human meaning that lies within those ideas, and can we sort of extract those and translate them into our own terms without doing radical violence to the text itself. That was a real theological project of his, to try and reinterpret the meanings, the ethical meanings, the human meanings that he found, maybe today we would call them the spiritual meanings, that he found in the Gospels. And, it was very controversial and very interesting. And so I lifted that term from him because I think that's what's been happening. Although nobody has really come out and said this is what we're doing, I think it's almost happened with Buddhism at a little bit just level. People have been selecting sort of the elements of the tradition that translate well into modern culture, and often just sort of ignoring some of the other elements. And so that is the demythologization. And one of the examples that I use, and this really could sort of be an example of psychologization as well, is there's a passage by Chogyam Trungpa where he talks about the wheel of life. And, many of us, probably of your listeners, have seen these very beautiful, vivid Tibetan images of the wheel of life with the different realms of rebirth. You can be reborn as a hungry ghost, or you can be reborn as a god or a human or an animal or somebody in hell. And so I don't know if Trungpa I would imagine that he may have believed some version of that still, but there was a passage that I came across that I found very interesting in which he really demythologized that. He made the main meaning of that, and the most important meaning, at least as he was talking to Westerners, that these were representative of psychological states, and that we might be in a hell realm one minute and, an hour later, be in a kind of animal realm, or feel like a hungry ghost, or, be very desirous. And so this became a sort of map of the mind rather than a map of the cosmos.
Right. Well, go ahead.
So, that's one way that I think Buddhism has become sort of, interiorized and removed a little bit from the cosmological environment that it grew up in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you say in the book, for Trungpa, the primary significance of the realms is they symbolize various states of mind, helping practitioners to map them out and ultimately free themselves from their dominance. To me, it was very important about that distinction, and we see that in Mahayana tradition with, I think it's a story of Takuan and a swordsman who comes to his door and, wants to know about heaven and hell, and Takuan says, you're not even worth talking to, and that, of course, gets the swordsman very angry and says, that's hell. And the swordsman goes, oh, and he kind of gets it and calms down and says, and that's heaven.
Yeah.
And so we have these references to them being mind states, but as you're saying, it is only becoming these days that we're seeing it very clearly described as such, and that to many of us has been wonderfully liberating in that we've had this cognitive dissonance with traditional literal interpretations of these kinds of views presented in traditional Buddhism, and that to be able to view them and that they work quite well when we see them as mind states is terrifically appealing and actually supports our practice.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you also were talking a bit about detraditionalization, and that embodies the modernist tendency to elevate reason, experience, and intuition over tradition, and to assert the freedom to reject, adopt, or reinterpret traditional beliefs and practices on the basis of individual evaluation. Now, there are also some components to this that I wanted us to touch on, because we've had some discussions on the web about the hierarchical structures and some of the abuses of power we see in various centers across the world and various different traditions. We see this in a lot of the buzz on Catholic priests and their excesses and things like that. We are, in our culture, a bit more interested in self-reliance and a bit more rejecting of that authority figure. Could you tell us a little bit about the whole detraditionalization and some of the things that entails?
Yeah, I think very broadly it entails a kind of shift from thinking of one's religious life primarily as wrapped up in an institution and in a whole sort of social structure of authority, and shifting the authority really to the individual. And I think, there are some good things and some potentially problematic things about that. If it's all just about my decision, then I'm sort of divorcing myself from the accumulated centuries of decisions that have been made, and it can be a kind of ego assertive mode, So I think there's some danger to just thinking of Buddhism or just thinking of any kind of religious or spiritual tradition as just me in my personal journey.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, they're just, in any religious tradition, and certainly in Buddhism, there comes a time for a Westerner particularly who gets interested in Buddhism and gets closer and closer to it. And the closer you get to it, especially if you travel around and if you find a little bit more traditional ways of practicing, where you're going to, as you said, you kind of bump up against things that where there's some cognitive dissonance. And there are, I guess, certain maybe non-negotiable elements of modern Western culture that, you just have to grapple with it. For instance, I think most modern Western educated people are not going to accept a kind of gender hierarchy thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so then, you have some decisions to make, either individually or as a part of a Sangha or something like that. Are you just going to say, well, this is Buddhism, this is the tradition, and I'm just going to have to set aside that thing? I think most people aren't going to do that. They're going to find a way to reinterpret or ignore certain elements of the tradition. And, that comes to be more, there's just more freedom, to make those decisions, I think, today in the modern world than, there have been in other historical and cultural contexts.
Yeah, and we see this occurring with the ordination of nuns a year or so ago that Ajahn Brahm did, that has caused quite a stir because he was well aware that this was perhaps going to be problematic for the traditional community, but really isn't something prohibited by Buddhism, even the tradition, the Theravada tradition. So that's exactly as you're saying. We do need to find either new ways to reinterpret what's there, or accept it as is, or deny it and move on.
Yeah, yeah. And, I guess one of the good things is that the Buddhist tradition is so diverse, and there are so many, literally thousands of texts that you can consider, authoritative texts in the tradition, that you have to be selective in some way or another. Mm-hmm. So it allows you some degree of freedom to say, well, here is an example of, something that would seem to support, for instance, gender equality. And we as a Sangha, or I as an individual, or whatever, we choose to affirm that and get behind that rather than some of the other institutionalized practices that have developed over the years.
Well, and that's why it was in a discussion recently where someone kept on describing true Buddhists and true Buddhism and actual Buddhists, and this was the, no true Scotsman fallacy. It's like, what's true Buddhism? What do you mean by that?
Yeah.
And of course the discussion evolves into a discussion of, well, I mean the earliest, the Theravada text. I'm like, well, in the Theravada, Buddha was asked how are we going to recognize what a real teaching is when it comes along? And he said, well, it has to have the 3 marks. And beyond that, there wasn't really anything more to be said. It didn't involve a specific scriptural set. It involved ideas. Yeah. And that's one reason in the new page set out on the Secular Buddhist website under Guiding Principles have added that secular Buddhism supports a culture of awakening, finding its inspiration from Buddhist and non-Buddhist, religious and secular sources alike. Mm. So it's really open to whatever is of value, and as you were saying, through one's experience and reason, that we see what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, yeah.
So looking again at the psychoanalysis side of it, we see that, another quote from your book, I told you I was going to do this. Mm-hmm. If psychoanalysis has aided Buddhism, recent practical psychotherapies have helped to detraditionalize it, allowing meditation to operate in non-Buddhist therapeutic settings, often for non-Buddhist goals without requiring commitment to explicitly Buddhist values. So we see that this particular practice of what's going on in the mind, the things that have been discovered and practiced for a couple of thousand years, are finding a very comfortable home outside of its religious setting. And again, I think as you've been saying in the book, this is somewhat inevitable.
Yeah, well, there's such a detailed and sophisticated analysis of the mind in a lot of Buddhist texts. And, so it sort of forms a natural home away from home in Western psychology. And I think psychology has been one of the ways in which Buddhism has sort of found a kind of evolutionary niche in the Western world, and again, more broadly in the kind of globalized modern world. In that, first of all, I mentioned in the book that part of the psychologization is that it allowed for some symbolic understandings of deities and things like that, things that you will see people praying to, very fervently all around Asia. But Westerners, for the most part, just have a hard time doing that. I think there are some that do that, and in some ways, some less demythologized versions of Buddhism are finding some success now in the West. But I think for the most part, we have these twin prohibitions in the West. One is the ancient prohibition against idolatry and polytheism, and the other is the kind of modern rationalist scientific understanding of matter. You don't have stone is stone, and so there's a real aversion, I think, on the part of many Westerners to doing some of the very routine practices that are done in Asia. Worshiping the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, praying to them for worldly benefits and things like that. So, to be able to interpret all that big pantheon of beings as, again, sort of psychological archetypes, which is what Carl Jung started the process of doing, has been an important way in which I think Buddhism has gained a sort of foothold in the West. So that Westerners could say, oh, okay, this is not just a big kind of polytheistic gaggle of gods and out there. It's actually, some kind of very sophisticated analysis of the mind. And, there are problems with that interpretation, too, if you're interpreting that as an accurate description of what the average Tibetan or Chinese practitioner is doing. Because I think many of them really are worshiping gods.
Yeah.
And I want to respect that, as a scholar especially, and just as somebody who doesn't want my vision of culture to be overriding and overrunning all the other cultures, as my culture tends to do. So I don't want to just say, well, we've got the good demythologized version and these silly pagans are out there worshiping their gods.
Mm-hmm.
I want to respect that, and I want to also just recognize that I can't do that, and a lot of Westerners can't really do that. And so can we have some other kind of relationship to the tradition that is, not sort of doing violence to the spirit of the tradition itself.
Yeah, and you say that in the book is, in fact, I'll read two quotes because this is going to lead into someone I want to ask you about, Soen Shaku. You've said, what I've called elsewhere the core versus accretions model of Buddhism is the view that Buddha himself taught a rationalistic, empirically based, psychological, and ethical doctrine that was free of superstition, largely compatible with modern science. And you also talk about in the book that the first Asians to present Buddhism to the West boldly proclaimed its essential compatibility with science and the scientific method. And you talk about Soen Shaku, who is a representative of the Japanese delegation to the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago in, I think it was 1893. Tell us a bit about his story and because the background to that and what was going on at that parliament was fascinating. So could you tell us about what was going on there?
Yeah, well, of course, this was really the first time in human history when representatives of really all the major world religions got together in one place and sort of presented their tradition to everybody else. So it was a real event, and it was a little bit, maybe a lot sort of weighted on the side of Christianity. That liberal Christians of the time were putting this on, and they were doing it in a for its time a very broad-minded gesture of inclusion and inviting all these people from many different places to get together and discuss their traditions. And yet it was during
from a position of Christian privilege, is how I would say.
Exactly. And it was during a time of colonialism where a lot of these people were coming from countries that were colonized by the British, that were being missionized very actively, and those two processes went hand in hand. And it was also during a time of increasing European and Western political and economic and military hegemony. So Asian countries that hadn't been colonized were very fearful of being colonized. And they were, in Japan, for instance, had not been colonized, but it was sort of aggressively thinking about, well, how do we sort of make our stand in this new modern world that's taking shape? And how do we stand against Europe and at the same time sort of reach out and figure out how to deal with these guys? So really, Soen Shaku was on more than just a religious mission. He was also on a kind of political mission to present Japan as a very sophisticated modern country that could play with the other sophisticated modern countries. And so in that context, he gave a very stripped down version. He and another one, Dharmapala, is another famous Anagarika, Dharmapala from what was at the time Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. Both of them gave very sort of scientific versions of Buddhism, very selected passages that they would emphasize. Didn't mention anything about the living practices of Buddhists at the time. And in a sense, they adopted an emerging Western picture of Buddhism that was also taking shape at that time by scholars. Now, the scholars who were interested in Buddhism at that time, there was just starting to emerge a cadre of scholars that were interested in Buddhism and realized that there was really some interesting, psychological and philosophical ideas in this tradition, in contrast to the first wave of how Buddhism was presented to the West, which was, of course, there's just this kind of crazy pagan idolatry and nihilistic, and Asians were all lazy, and there are all these kind of terrible stereotypes that you see in the literature of this time. And so, out of that came a kind of reaction on the part of scholars, and certainly a reaction on the part of colonized Asians, who had to start looking at their own tradition and saying, okay, how do we think about our tradition in relation to what's happening? Here are these Western Christians who have become very successful in the world materially. They're dominating the world more and more by the day. And they claim to have this very rational approach to the world and a scientific approach. And is there something in our tradition that can sort of resonate with that? So in a sense, that I think is really how Buddhist modernism started. It's with Asians rethinking their own tradition, starting to get away from the more ritual practices, the more devotional practices, at least among the elite and the educated folks, and starting to think about how Buddhism could work in relation to these very powerful intellectual forces that were emerging. Of course, political forces too, but in terms of, they often presented it more in terms of intellectual forces, because this was a time, remember, when Darwinism was suddenly the biggest kind of cutting edge idea, and this was very threatening to Christianity. The Enlightenment notions of cause and effect that didn't really allow room for a God to come and intervene in the natural laws, that this was so. Buddhists started to use these terms to describe their own tradition. Well, our tradition really has some version of natural law. Ours believes in cause and effect. Ours is not really incompatible with evolution. So, again, the early formation of Buddhist modernism was in this kind of fraught, tense atmosphere of competition and oppression and response to those forces.
Yeah. And you say, I'm going to have two quotes here which were actually, to me as a science geek, very telling. One is the historical question regarding contemporary Buddhism then is not, is Buddhism scientific, but how is Buddhism transforming itself through its engagement with science? And then following that up, and this is a quote I used in a paper I was asked to write for a Theravada monk for a book that's being published. I quoted you as saying, A tradition must then survive in an environment other than the one it is involved in. It must adapt. It must connect with the tacit assumptions, cultural norms, and social and institutional practices of an entirely different ideological ecosystem. It must take on new meanings as translators and interpreters strike notes that resonate with the underlying harmonies of the new culture.
Mm.
Yeah, you wrote that. I know, pretty good. Huh?
That's pretty good.
I did. Yeah, I like that one. It was very poetic. And what strikes me, other than of course the evolutionary terminology, which I adore, is that we see that happening right now.
Yeah.
And what I'm wondering is, with your scholarship and study of this over many years, and as a practitioner, where you see, and knowing that you don't have a crystal ball, of course, you can't make perhaps sound predictions as some folks can, where your opinion is of what this might lead to. What are some of the new vistas and opportunities for this particular kind of modern practice to go?
Yeah. Well, it's a tough question because, the whole phenomenon of globalization, it's like throwing something at a fan and just watching it splatter all over the place. You just never know what's going to come up. So I think, one of the worries that people have, scholars mostly, I think, are the ones, and probably more traditional practitioners, is that this kind of newfangled modernist type of Buddhism is going to sort of elbow its way in, around the globe and, start sort of making fun of people bowing in front of statues, and it's going to just sort of recreate a kind of soft version of the Western colonialism that was happening years ago. That it's going to be a kind of ideological displacement of a lot of the vast variety of cultures. I don't really think that's going to happen. I think that this will be one form of Buddhism, I don't even think it's one form. It's actually already a number of different forms. And I think it'll just take its place along the many, many other varieties of Buddhism that are out there. It does have some prestige to it because really I think, some of the most well-known Buddhists alive right now are in many ways modernists. But if you look at them too, they're not always, the Dalai Lama is a really interesting example. Mm-hmm. He obviously is a modernist in many ways. He has this very avid interest in science, and he understands the science and knows about it and encourages people to, stick meditating monks in fMRI machines. And,
right.
And, so in that way, he's a reformer too. He makes these radical statements like, if science proves that some aspect of Buddhist doctrine is really definitively wrong, then we've got to let it go. On the other hand, he's still very rooted in his cultural tradition. He, consults the oracle. He clearly very much embraces the traditional notions of birth and rebirth. So, I think, what we'll see is not one form of Buddhism sort of becoming the dominant one, but rather more and more kind of interesting, odd combinations and hybridizations. And that's globalization does. It just allows for more and more variety, I think, rather than, it is possible that one would just kind of jump up and dominate, but I doubt it. I doubt if that's going to happen.
Yeah, I agree. That's something that people who are very traditional are stressing about right now. And we see this in examples like B. Alan Wallace article, Distorted Visions of Buddhism, Agnostic and Atheist, where he is openly critical of this particular kind of approach and is very concerned that it will taint what the practice is. And I do completely understand that concern, because people who are taking this approach, like Stephen Batchelor, Stephen Scattini, other folks like that, we're very concerned about not wrecking the practice.
Yeah.
And the idea that somehow this is going to now replace traditional sanghas, traditional communities, is just not so. And and it's not a just not so. It's not so for very important reasons. That culturally, these traditional centers are designed to serve a particular ethnic community, and that kind of community bonding is a very strong thing that we would have no intention or desire to break or hinder in any way, because that's part of what we value as human beings in having a rich and diverse human culture. So I am totally with you on the idea that this is not going to wreck other traditional forms. It is simply another way for people who do not come from those traditional forms to find meaningful practice without that cognitive dissonance. They'll find one that resonates very well for their particular situation.
Yeah, and I think there is a legitimate concern that Buddhism in some quarters can become trivialized, can become commercialized, and we see that happening. I mean, that there's no doubt that is out there, and it would be a shame if that came to be so dominant that the only thing that you could think of when you hear the word Zen is Zen popcorn or something like that.
Right.
and so that's a legitimate concern. But I mean, the fact is, we live in this crazy media saturated commercialized culture that does that with everything. It doesn't just do it with Buddhism. It just takes everything and makes it into a kind of parody of itself. So as long as hopefully, as long as there are people who know a little bit more about the tradition itself and can distinguish between these sort of silly versions of it and something that's more real, I think it will not be in danger.
Not in the least. And as the opportunities present themselves for, say, secular Buddhist or Western or modern, whatever we want to call it, as those opportunities increase with globalization and more access to everyone for information that a few hundred years ago people did not have access to, it's something to bear in mind that that's also open to the traditional forms. They are also able to have websites which allow people to learn more about their particular kind of practice, that it's not limited only modern Buddhist practice can do website. No, everyone can.
Right.
So, David, what's next for you? What are you working on?
Well, right now I'm finishing up an edited volume that it's going to be called Buddhism in the Modern World, and I've compiled a really nice group of scholars to talk about Buddhism in various geographical contexts, and then also in thematically, Buddhism and the media, Buddhism and pop culture, globalization, ethics, science, different areas like that. And so that's almost done on my end. So that'll be coming out within a year. And then I'm just starting to think about the next project, which I'm a little hesitant even to mention because it's still just a germ of an idea. And usually when I have a germ of an idea, by the time it comes out the other end, it's a completely different idea. The germ really is, and I'm going to start doing a little bit of research on it this summer. I'm going to Sri Lanka and trying to do some interviews. I want to think about meditation and the different meanings that meditation has in different Buddhist cultures around the world. Somebody who is has gone to their health club and taken a course in, relaxation, who may not even know that they're actually taking a course in shamatha meditation, is obviously there's a very different meaning and significance that they attach to meditation than a Tibetan monk who's on a 3-year retreat in a cave in the Himalayas.
Right. Right.
And so I'd like to sort of do a kind of comparative study of, what meditation means in these different cultures. And then, of course, it gets complicated by our very contemporary media saturated world, where you might have some guy who's just gotten out of the cave in Tibet who goes into the health club and starts teaching a class in meditation.
Right.
So, how these things cross over and how new meanings get created out of all these different meanings that are already out there.
Mm-hmm. That sounds terrific. I would love to talk with you about especially both of those books when the germ becomes a full book. Of course, I want to hear about that.
Some motivation to make it happen.
But the one that is nearing completion, I would love to have you back on the podcast to speak about that, because that will also be a right on target kind of topic for this podcast. So I'd love to have you back to talk about that.
Great. Thank you.
All right. We've been speaking with David McMahan, Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Franklin and Marshall College. The book we've been talking about, and I will have a link to this on the website for the Secular Buddhist for this episode, is The Making of Buddhist Modernism. For people who have read this, you are nodding sagely, and you know what I'm talking about. For those of you who have not yet read the book, This is one of my top 5 picks of Buddhist books, especially on contemporary practice. So do get that. It's also available on Kindle if you don't want to kill any trees, which is how I got mine, which is why I have all these quotes handy. David, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you, Ted. It was fun. I enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for the Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on the Secular Buddhist.